Above all things, obedience is an essential feature in the character of a child, especially of a schoolboy or girl. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in intellectual history, especially the great classics. From each I've selected an excerpt. 30-40 minutes is our target. Our purpose is to do a close reading of an important text with the accompanying text. In this episode, we are turning to Immanuel Kant's On Education, published in 1803, the year before his death, based on years of lectures he had delivered at his university over the course of his long career. Let's go to the text. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on chapter 5 of Kant's work on education, and it's on moral culture. Now, since this is an applied work, I want to say a few positioning or groundwork things about Kant's more abstract and general philosophy to set the groundwork for these more applied comments about how we should be educating children to prepare them to enter into moral culture. Now, there's one quotation from section 9 earlier in the work on education that in which Kant highlights an important point that he returns to several times. So here's the quotation. How important it is that children should learn from their youth to detest vice, not merely on the ground that God has forbidden it, but because vice is detestable in itself. Now, this is an important point for a couple of reasons, both in terms of ethical theory and ethical application. And one important issue is that while Kant, in many respects, is in keeping with traditional religion, he does diverge from traditional religion in some important respects. And so here is this view that vice is something that should be detested, but why should vice be detested? And what Kant is going to be arguing, as someone who is more modern, is that it's not merely that an authority figure, God, excuse me, in this case has said so, and then so we follow God obediently because he has said so, but that in some sense we are able to recognize that wrong things are wrong in themselves and that we have the intellectual capacity to do so. Now, it's not incompatible with God having said that they are wrong, but we also are not mere followers. Now, one way to see where Kant is positioning himself is to go back to, in this case, the core religious traditions in the Western traditions, the core text, the Bible, Genesis, and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And what we learn is, from the beginning, human beings are sinful creatures. And if we ask what the first sin was, it was disobedience. So Adam and Eve are put in this wonderful place, the Garden of Eden. God gives them free range of the place with one instruction: leave a certain tree alone. God then goes away. But what is the first thing that Eve does as an independent agent in the Garden of Eden? She steals a fruit from the tree, takes a bite, passes it off to Adam, making him complicit as well. So Eve was disobedient. And so it's going to then make sense by inference that the most important virtue in this tradition is going to be obedience, if we are highlighting disobedience as the first sin. Now, what is exactly wrong with this sin, and how do we correct for that sin? And a standard analysis is to say that Eve is going by her self-interest. The apple looks tasty to her; she wants it, and that's her overriding value. So she takes the apple, and so it then follows, as a matter of solving this problem of self-love, what we're going to need is some sort of enforcement agent who is watching, and when the sin manifests itself, is then in a position to call out the sin and punish. And so a moral teaching will then be in response to self-love that will lead human beings astray, to teach them that God is watching them and he will punish them in the very short term if they do wrong things. But this then is to say that we are basing our morality on a conception of self-love in significant part. Now, there's then going to be an improvement as this tradition goes along, and it will say that, that what human beings will learn to do is not necessarily that God is watching them all of the time, or that God will immediately punish them for any of their transgressions, but that in the long run, perhaps in the afterlife, any sins that they commit will be subject to an ultimate justice and some sort of punishment, perhaps in the longer run. Now, this is an improvement because it then enables human beings, or says that human beings rather, are able to think bigger picture. They're able to think of the long run. They're able to think of the distant future, perhaps even conceiving of an afterlife, and then to regulate their actions on behalf of that larger framework. And so they're not just short-range animals, so to speak, pushed around by immediate fears of punishment and rewards. Nonetheless, Kant and others in this tradition want to say that this approach is still appealing to self-love. In this case, it's just that I want the best outcome for myself in, say, the afterlife. I want to go to heaven. I don't want to go to hell. And so I will be moral, but only because it is in my long-term self-interest to do so. And one thing that Kant is then indicating with this quote that we looked at is to say vice is detestable in itself. It's not detestable because of its consequences or because of its effect on your self-love and what's going to happen to you in the future. Some things are right, some things are wrong, some things are good, some things are bad, intrinsically or inherently. And so what Kant is going to want to argue is that we should be obeying moral principles independently of their effect on ourselves. So it doesn't matter if we're going to get rewards or if we're going to get punishments. The thing is right or wrong, and so we do it or don't do it because we recognize it as such. Now, on the basis of that, then, what we will find, and this is where Kant sounds like a traditional religious thinker, when we turn to chapter 5 on moral culture, that Kant will return to the same theme of obedience. And what we then find is, in keeping with traditional religion, we get the implication that disobedience is the fundamental badness that human beings can engage in, and that obedience is the most important thing. And so we have this above all things, which is a very strong formulation. Obedience is the essential feature that we need to instill in children. But we're then at the same time going to have to be careful that it's not going to be obedience because of short run or long run, that human beings are going to be able to understand as intelligent beings the rightness or wrongness of things in itself, and so regulate their behavior in accordance with that understanding. Now, from another work, this is Kant's famous, it's a short work, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, when he wants to say what it is to become a virtuous person is as follows. To behold virtue in her proper shape is nothing other than to show morality stripped of all admixture with the sensuous. I'm going to pause there for a moment. That sounds again like a traditional religious position. It's nothing to do with the sensuous world, the physical world, things that appeal to our senses, our bodies. Morality is independent entirely of that realm. It's purified of any admixture with those things. We might then say it's more about the soul or the spirit or the mind or the conscience, but something that is not mixed with the sensuous at all. And, carrying on the quote, of all the spurious adornments of reward or self-love. And that's the point we were indicating. Now, that then sounds like a traditional religious opinion. Obedience to commands that have nothing to do with your self-love, with your self-interest, nothing to do even entirely with the sensuous realm, that it's some sort of inherent or intrinsic right or wrong, a set of commands that we then obey. But in the same work, in just a couple of sections later, Kant indicates a way in which he is not a traditional religious thinker. We are going to be obeying these intrinsically right views, not because it's a matter of blind faith, not because we are afraid of God's power and that he is going to punishment. So it's not going to be any sort of faith. It's not going to be any sort of emotion or desire-driven thing, but rather we human beings are rational, and if we are trained correctly, we can come to grasp the intrinsic rightness of some things, the intrinsic wrongness of some things, and so regulate our behavior obediently in respect to those principles. Now, why he thinks these are rational principles, ultimately that's a big philosophical project. And Kant's two most important work, his Critique of Pure Reason and his Critique of Practical Reason, are the works that one would need to go to find his philosophical rationale and argumentation for that. But in this applied work on education, we're taking all of that philosophical background for granted. And now our question is, how do we as parents and especially as teachers then instill that kind of moral character in children? Now, another way to frame Kant's writings on education is to put his writings in the context of two earlier, perhaps three earlier thinkers with whom he is familiar. Of course, he, in this work that we're looking at on education, references Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the famous Swiss-French education philosopher, and you can see some influence of Rousseau in there. We'll save that for now. But on the landscape in German philosophy were two giants, particularly with respect to education philosophy. One, Sulzer, and Sulzer was a Swiss-German thinker who was probably the most influential education philosopher in the middle part of the 1700s when Kant was in his intellectual maturity. Kant knew Sulzer, he corresponded with Sulzer, he refers to Sulzer at some points in his writings, and we know that Sulzer is on his mind, particularly if we take note of these comments on obedience, where Sulzer had written in his famous work, came out in a couple of editions in his lifetime. Obedience is so important that all education is actually nothing other than learning how to obey. And when a philosopher, particularly a philosopher of education, says something so strong as this, it's always worth asking what the contrasts are. We're saying this is what education is all about, obedience. And then saying, well, what is it not about? Well, it's not about creativity, say. It's not about independence. It's not about learning self-responsibility to prepare yourself for a liberal society. It's not about the pursuit of happiness. And we might then consider all of the other candidates that many educators will say, this is the top value, what goes in our mission statement. For Sulzer, it is about obedience. And we have a very strong form of obedience advocated for in Sulzer, because he recognizes, in keeping with this long tradition of saying that human beings are perhaps sinful beings or perhaps beings with a strong inclination toward the bad. And so implanting and teaching obedience is very, very difficult. But in this same work, note what Sulzer says. It is not very easy, however, to implant obedience in children. It is quite natural for the child's soul to want to have a will of its own, and things that are not done correctly in the first 2 years will be very difficult to rectify thereafter. One of the advantages of these early years is then that force and compulsion can be used. Over the years, children forget everything that happened to them in early childhood. If their wills can be broken at this time, I'm going to pause there. Our goal is to break the wills of children in their early years, using force and compulsion as necessary. Well, picking up the quotation again, they will never remember afterwards that they had a will. And for this reason, the severity that is required will not have any serious consequences. Now, the point of emphasizing Sulzer is that Sulzer is emphasizing a very strong form of obedience. And of course, there's a long tradition of emphasizing obedience and what we need to do strictly, even to the point of using force and compulsion on children to instill obedience in them. That's huge on Kant's intellectual landscape and represents one pole of the debate. But at the same time, in addition to Sulzer, we do need to mention John Locke, the great English philosopher, who, on this very same set of issues, Kant, of course, is well aware of Locke. He does not refer to Locke by name on education, but we can see that he is responding to some Lockean points from Locke's thoughts concerning education, which were also extraordinarily influential on the course of English and more broadly British education, early American education, and then as the Enlightenment of the 1700s had flourished in Europe, on European education. But Locke represents perhaps the opposite pole to someone like Sulzer. That instead of obedience and instead of force and compulsion, what Locke is going to be emphasizing is liberty and play. And at this point, this is from Locke's Some Thoughts Concerning Education. Great care is to be taken that education be never made as a business to him, nor he look at it as a task. Pausing there for a moment. Business in the old sense of work, you have to go to work, you have to do certain things. That's not what we want education to be, Locke is saying. It shouldn't be just a series of tasks that are imposed on you that you have to do out of some sense of obligation or duty or external compulsion. Instead, Locke makes this point about human nature. We naturally, even from our cradles, love liberty and therefore have an aversion to many things for no other reason but because they are enjoined us. So pausing there on the quotation, that Locke is then is to say, we try to make children do things that they don't naturally want to do. We give them a long list of things and they naturally rebel against that because liberty and doing things our own way and exerting our own will is a natural human birthright. And he's then saying that education should be working with that rather than against it and trying to break it. Carrying on the quotation again, I've always had a fancy that learning might be made a play and recreation to children, unquote. Education should be fun, enjoyable, that we should work with children's natural interests, their natural inclinations, their natural love of freedom, and developing their capacities, and build the education program around them. So we have Locke at this end of the spectrum, Sulzer at that end of the spectrum. Right? Obedience, liberty, force and compulsion, play and recreation. Now, one more line quickly from John Locke. We know that in the case of moral traditions and education traditions that emphasize obedience, they expect there to be lots of disobedience, and the natural consequence of that is that therefore punishment has to be used as a very important educational tool. Disobediences must be punished. And what we find again, by contrast to those systems like Sulzer's that emphasize punishment a lot, the Lockean liberty and play traditions are going to de-emphasize punishment quite a lot. And so one more quotation from from Locke here. I am very apt to think that great severity of punishment does but very little good, nay, great harm in education. And I believe it will be found that ceteris paribus, that is to say, keeping other factors equal, those children who have been most chastised seldom make the best men. So our question then is going to be, as we turn to Kant, with that set of moral principles in background and this context of a debate between Sulzerians and Lockeans on issues of obedience and liberty, punishment and play, where does Kant fit? All right, let's turn to the text directly. On moral culture, this is now chapter 5. Section 77, moral culture must be based on maxims, not upon discipline. The one prevents evil habits, the other trains the mind to think. Now, what we mean by a maxim here, Kant is arguing, is an abstract rule or an abstract principle that one is grasping by the light of one's own thinking or by the light of one's own reason. And so what we are striving for is to have children grow up to be the kinds of being who can grasp rules, grasp principles, understand what they mean for themselves, and then regulate their behavior in terms of them. Instead of discipline, and by contrast, discipline here, it meant other imposed discipline. Now, it's true to say that we can impose a lot of discipline, and Kant is going to grant that a lot of that will be necessary in the early years, but that all it does is instills from the outside certain habits of actions, and that's fine as an initial stage, but we should always remember in the long run we're trying to train students to understand, not merely be automata that are following rules. Through discipline, carrying on, we form certain habits, moreover, the force of which becomes lessened in the course of years. The child should learn to act according to maxims, the reasonableness of which he is able to see for himself. All right, so that's indicating right off the bat our goal. So how are we going to do so? Well, children don't come naturally at the age of reason. Reason needs to develop. Their habits need to develop. And then prior to their having habits and having their reason develop, they have all kinds of inclinations and various other things that well up in them. And so what we need to do is develop their character. The first endeavor in moral education is the formation of character. Character consists in the readiness to act in accordance with maxims. At first they are school maxims, but later maxims of mankind. So, pausing here, Kant wants to argue that, of course, first we put children in school, and the school is a smaller environment, and in many respects it is an artificial environment. And what we want the children to be able to do is to understand rules at the level of the school environment, which are narrower, more specific. And then because the child is not yet ready to think about culture, society, civilization, mankind as a whole. So this is a stepping stone toward character development in the full sense. At first, the child obeys rules. Now, but then we come to these rules being externally imposed and children's natural inclinations not to be in favor of them. The first mention of punishment, and that we're going to be emphasizing punishment rather a lot. No infringement of school discipline must be allowed to go unpunished, although the punishment must always fit the offense. So 2 points there. We're not going to be slack, cut the children some room, say kids are going to be kids, they will grow out of it. Instead, we're going to have the rules, and one of the things children need to learn is that rules are absolute. They are universally binding, no exceptions whatsoever. And so that then means that we cannot allow any rule breaking to go unpunished. Although he does at the same time want to say, against many old-fashioned punishers, that for a small infraction we should not be giving a large punishment. Punishments need to fit the crime. Now, how are we then going to do this? The argument is that if we want children to learn to obey rules, children, though by nature, are unruly. That is to say, it's not in their nature yet or in their habits to follow rules. They want to do their own thing, to be range of the moment, to do this in this case and this in that case according to whims, desires, feelings, whatever that happens to be going on, or different circumstances. So what we then need to do, Kant is to say, impose structure, a strong discipline structure in everything. So notice this very strong formulation. If we want to, or rather if we wish to form the characters of children, it is of the greatest importance to point out to them a certain plan and certain rules in everything, and these must be strictly adhered to. For instance, they must have set times for sleep, for work, and for pleasure, and these times must be neither shortened nor lengthened. All right, so strict schedule followed absolutely at all times. And then the idea then is the child gets the habit of being a rule-following being, and that starts to develop their character in the proper direction, which is obedience to absolute, strict rules. Now, what then more specifically are going to be the contents of these characters, and what we find over the course of the the rest of this chapter is that Kant highlights 3 character traits. So these are going to be the foundational character traits around which everything is going to be built. And then the first one is here in section 8, and number 1. And notice the congruity with the Sulzer points about what the most important thing is, and the congruity with the certain religious tradition that had emphasized disobedience as the cardinal sin. So we have Kant here saying, above all things. And when a philosopher like Kant says above all things, he means that this is number 1. It's not creativity, it's not liberty, it's not developing their rational independence, it's not developing their friendliness, it's not developing their sense of adventure. It is obedience. Obedience is an essential feature in the character of a child, especially of a school boy or girl. Now then we get to the beginnings of a breakdown of different kinds of obedience, and some of this is going to be developmental and contextual. This obedience is twofold, including absolute obedience to his master's commands and obedience to what he feels to be a good and reasonable will. And what Kant is going to be arguing then is that obedience to rules can come in one of 2 ways. One is someone else, a master, perhaps your parents, your teachers, point out to you that there is a rule, and that master enforces that rule on you, and you obey the rule, but because it is being enforced by the master. That is one kind of obedience. Another kind of obedience, though, and this is going to be the longer one Kant wants us to strive for, is to get the child or the youth or the young adult to the point where they will say, this is what I think is a good and reasonable will by my judgment, and I will obey that. And so we're trying to get from the one form of obedience to the other obedience. Obedience may be the result of compulsion, that is to say, externally imposed. It is then absolute, or it may arise out of confidence. Then it is obedience of the second kind. And by confidence, Kant means I have thought about it, I've figured out what this means, and I am confident, so to speak, in my own judgment that this is the right thing to do, and so I act confidently on the basis of it. This voluntary obedience is very important, but the former is also very necessary, for it prepares the child for the fulfillment of laws that he will have to obey later as a citizen, even though he may not like them. So yes, following the rules is not a matter of liking, it's not a matter of inclination, it's a matter of what you want to do. It is a matter of what you think and know is the right thing to do. That's what we are preparing for. Carrying on, this law, however, must be a general one, a rule which has to be kept constantly in view, especially in schools. And now a point about the laws are general and they are absolute, but they also are universally. They apply to all of us, and they apply to all of us equally. And so therefore this needs to be embodied in the master, parent, or probably in this case the teacher. The master must not show any predilection or preference for one child above the others, for thus the law would cease to be general. So there's not one set of rules for one child or one set of children or others. They are applying absolutely and universally. Now here we come to a passage where Kant takes up Locke implicitly, and the language here is directly Lockean and Locke's followers. One often hears it said that we should put everything before children in such a way that they shall do it from inclination. And Kant then goes on to say, well, in some cases this is all true. It is true, this is all very well, but there is much besides which we must place before them as duty. and this will be of great use to them throughout their life. 4. When we think about, pausing the quotation, adult life, life is largely a matter of doing your duty at work as a citizen, paying your taxes, and so on. For in the paying of rates and taxes, in the work of the office, and in many other cases, we must be led not by inclination, but by duty. And so more broadly, what Kant is arguing is that adult life is not a matter of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. It is a matter of obligations and duty. And so school and childhood should be preparation for that conception of adult life. Now, children are children. They don't really understand the big picture, but Kant says this habit of doing your duty must be instilled. Even though a child should not be able to see the reason of a duty, it is nevertheless better that certain things should be prescribed in this way. So it becomes habitual. When someone tells you, your parent, your teacher, perhaps later a politician, that something is your duty, your trained habit then will be, or your default mode will be to obey, even if you don't particularly understand, and that's the direction that we want to go. Of course, the ideal will be that you also understand, but not always will that be feasible. Now, at the same time, we know we're emphasizing obedience, but children are children. Human beings are human beings, and so there's going to be a lot of disobedience. Section 83. Every transgression of a command in a child is a want of obedience, and this brings punishment with it. Every transgression must be punishment. Also, should a command be disobeyed through inattention, punishment is still necessary. So it's not that the child is, say, even willfully disobeying, just wasn't paying attention or whatever. You still must punish because a rule was broken. And then we get into a taxonomy of the various kinds of punishments, and when those punishments are appropriate for the circumstance. And so do pay careful attention, especially as we're going through, how much time Kant devotes to punishment in the context of discussing disobedience. Punishment is either physical or moral. It is moral when we do something derogatory to the child's longing to be honored. So the child does something wrong, and we don't hit the child or spank the child or withdraw some sort of physical reward or physical benefit that the child has available to him or her. Instead, we shame the child. We maybe use our stern parent voice. We show that the child disapproves, and so we are using psychological or moral punishments with respect to the child. Or it can, of course, be physical punishment, and that is in the next paragraph here as well. Now, in the next section, though, punishment is important here. We return to this theme of punishment. Disobedience, again, repetition, is always followed by punishment, always followed by punishment. And now not a contrast only between moral and physical, but between natural and artificial punishments. So the child does something wrong, and there's a consequence of that is negative. Maybe one of the rules is, don't run in the hallway, but rather the child runs in the hallway, and the hallway is a little bit slippery, and so the child slips and falls, and then a natural consequence is that some physical pain happens to him. Now, we didn't inflict that on the child. It's a natural consequence of disobeying the rule. Or, by contrast, the punishment can be artificial, and that is to say, we, the teacher, we, the parent, inflict the punishment on the child. So, moral punishments, physical punishments, natural punishments, artificial punishments, and so parents and teachers should have a taxonomy of punishments that fit into each category, and some plan for when they are going to use each kind. Kant does go on to stay in keeping with our approach here. We are not doing things because of our inclinations or our emotions. And so, of course, when children act up and they are disobedient, that gets us upset. We get angry, we get irritated, we get frustrated. But Kant is pointing out that it's important for us that we are not doing it because we personally happen to be emotionally upset about it, or our mood is fragile in a given day. When we are punishing for the reason that the rule was stated, the rule was known, and the rule was broken. That is the lesson that we are trying to teach. So Kant says punishments inflicted with signs of anger are useless. So we need to keep our emotions out of the way. We should be perhaps saying, this was the rule, you broke the rule, here is the punishment, but saying it in a calm, rational tone of voice. So the attention is focused on the rule breaking, not the fact that we personally are upset by it. Now, another bit of taxonomy with respect to obedience and some indication. This is a more modern point where we find in the modern thinkers, Locke, Rousseau, and now Kant, increasing attention to developmental issues, what we do with infants, what we do with children, with youths, with young adults, and so on. The obedience of the growing youth must be distinguished from the obedience of the child. The former consists in submission to rules of duty. To do something for the sake of duty means obeying reason. It is in vain to speak to children of duty. So what we are looking for is that point at which children develop their rational capacity. They enter into the age of reason, so to speak. They will be obedient all through, but as the age of reason starts to manifest in the child turning into perhaps a youth, then we can expect obedience to be more reason imposed by the youth himself or herself rather than externally imposed by the master. Okay, so that's obedience with some breakdown of the various kinds of obedience and a significant amount on punishment, the types of punishments that are appropriate for disobedience. Now we move on to the second most important character trait that we want to develop in children. First is obedience. The second principal feature in the formation of a child's character is truthfulness, honesty, telling the truth, and in many cases perhaps the full truth, and again without exceptions, universally, absolutely, and always. Now, Kant then goes on to argue that this is something else that we have an inclination not to do, but perhaps in a kind of original sin, to the extent that Kant agrees with the traditional religious view, or some sort of natural physical inclination toward dishonesty is going to be in there in perhaps a less religious form and more naturalistic form. But nonetheless, Kant agrees that the inclination is there. Some children have an inclination towards lying, and this frequently for no other reason than that they have a lively imagination. So another possible reason why children are untruthful, shall we say, so frequently. And it is interesting here that Kant is then saying that what we're striving for is to get students to abstractly and rationally understand certain maxims, right, or abstract rules of behavior. But we have this other capacity for imagining fantasy worlds and making up things, and this is very lively in children as well. And so perhaps children are not so much using their reason as using their imagination, and they are living in an imaginary world to some extent, acting out their fantasies, and that is why. So it is interesting that Kant then is juxtaposing imagination and reason as contrary, perhaps contradictory as two strong faculties in this case. One leads us astray from the truth and the other points us toward the truth. And there's an earlier on education, Kant had made a point then of saying that any sort of imaginative literature should not be read to children and they should not have access to imaginative literature. So he's against fairy tales and reading fairy tales to children when they are young. That's earlier in section 69. And he also indicates that novels should not be a part of the curriculum and perhaps not even at home, because again, these are cultivating the imagination, and that leads children away from the strict and narrow focus on the truth and truthfulness. Now, again, immediately following that paragraph, we are back to the theme of punishments. Punishments may be divided into negative and positive punishments, and so we're going to have a more complicated chart. We have natural and artificial, moral and physical, and now we have negative punishments and positive punishments. And Kant gives some advice about when to use negative punishments and when to use positive punishments. Now, obedience, truthfulness. A third feature in the child's character is sociableness. And so it's important here that we learn how to be social creatures, to prepare ourselves, of course, for family life, for work life, for the life of being a citizen, all of which are social creatures. But it is interesting that Kant here is emphasizing not individuality. It's not that we are obedient as individuals to certain rules, or that we are truthful to reality, truthful to ourselves. Instead, it is sociable that is emphasized over the individuality here. So a third feature of the child's is sociableness, and one way of teaching the right kind of sociableness is going to be manifested by the teacher. The teacher should not, again, let self-love or personal preferences influence his or her thinking or behavior with respect to the children in his or her charge. Sociableness is a matter of certain general principles about how we are to relate to all other human beings without regard to our self-love. So, if a teacher allows himself to prefer one child to another, it must be on account of its character, not for the sake of any talents the child may possess. Otherwise, jealousy will arise, which is the opposed to friendship. So what we are then saying is, some child has better musical talents, right? Or some child is perhaps, friendly and more outgoing. Another child is more sullen. If children are obedient, if children are truthful, if children are being sociable properly, then the teacher, should not treat them any differently. The only reason I should be treating any child differently is in terms of their differences in being obedient, differences in being truthful, differences in being sociable. Everything else does not have a place in terms of my teacherly role. Now here we have what's always struck me as a very interesting paragraph about school, and as we read it through, it more than perhaps anything else in Kant's education gives a concrete image of what school is going to be like for children. And what Kant does want to say is, and this is going to be something that puts him not so extreme as Sulzer, and not so extreme as some traditional, sometimes very strict religious schools, or very strict traditional education schools that are not religious, where our emphasis really is upon breaking the will of children. Kant does not want to go that far. So he has this to say. Children should sometimes be released from the narrow constraint of school. Otherwise, their natural joyousness will soon be quenched. Now, pause and think about that for a moment. What Kant then seems to be saying is, you put a child in school. A child is naturally a joyous, cheerful, happy type of creature, but you put the child in school and immediately the child learns he or she has to be serious, no joy, no happiness. And if the child stays in the school environment too long, that natural joyousness is going to be quenched. It will go away. It will be just gone. And so Kant recognizes that school has to be, for the reasons he has given, a very strict, serious, not at all joyful, fun place, but we don't want to totally quench the natural joyousness. And so there should be some time for recess, and definitely some time out of school in which the children can be more natural children. When the child is set free, he soon recovers his natural elasticity. And that is something that we also should keep in mind as parents and teachers. So strictness, obedience, absolute rules that are always followed, punishment frequently, but not too much. Okay, again, I'm going to jump to section 90 here. This point about developmentalism, which I want to emphasize again as a very characteristically modern point. All of this abstract set of rules about obedience and so forth, and the nature of the specific rules that children are going to be and follow, are going to evolve. The same general strategy or template will be in place, but they will be applied in a way that's appropriate to children when they are very young, when they are youths, when they are young adults. And so part of developing a complete educational program will have those developmental issues as well. Now, one other interesting thing is hinted at here. What about children who, say, have natural talents that outstrip other children, or they are perhaps naturally slower than the average of other children? What do we say? Since here we're so much emphasizing moral character as central to education, what about all of the other things that could potentially be part of education? We are teaching physics, and suppose we have some child who, for whatever reason, becomes very interested in physics, thinks about physics all the time, and just becomes a whiz at physics, while the rest of the students are going at an average or below average pace. Or perhaps we have a child who is a natural music prodigy, right? A young Mozart, for example, shows up in your class and is just absolutely amazing at music, while in music classes the other children are not particularly interested, not particularly skilled, or interested but proceeding at a more average pace. Should we as teachers have special tracks, special favors, make exceptions, change the curricula around for students who are different? Or students who are, say, very good at mathematics, or have an extraordinary interest in Greek mythology and just are, have absorbed everything and have a great memory and so on. Now, Kant then talks directly to that issue here. Many parents are pleased with the precocity of their offspring. That is to say, when their children seem to be precociously or ahead of schedule, seem to be able to do certain things. But as a rule, nothing will come of such children. A child should be clever, but only as a child. He should not ape the manners of his elders. For a child to provide himself with moral sentences proper to manhood is to go quite beyond his province and to become merely an imitator. He ought to have merely the understanding of a child and not to display it too early. A precocious child will never become a man of insight and clear understanding. So, children who seem to be precocious in mathematics, in the classics, in music or physics or whatever, we should not be encouraging that. Instead, the implication here is that we should be treating all students at the same, more or less, level, and the curriculum should be adjusted to be universal. And so we're not going to get into any sort of favoritism or some students thinking that they are better than the other students, and that is going to undercut the sense of sociableness that Kant had alluded to a little bit earlier. Also issues about fashion and clothing. Kant, as part of his strictness, is wanting to argue we should be focusing on essential things, important things, fashion, clothing, etc., etc. Appearances are not very important. Plain, simple, everything. Finery is not suitable for children. At the end of this paragraph, they must accept their neat and simple clothes as necessaries merely. And parents and teachers should set a good example themselves. Now, just one closing remark to put Kant in the context that we had established earlier. Sulzer at one end of the spectrum, very strong emphasis on obedience, very strong emphasis on the use of force and compulsion. A very strong emphasis even on breaking the will of children so that they go forth as habitually following the rules and being obedient. John Locke at the other end of the spectrum, emphasizing our natural liberty, our desire to become free agents in our own lives, and building a curriculum around the natural inclinations of the children, incorporating lots of play and going easy on the punishment. One just striking stat about this chapter on moral culture from Kant on education. He is not as extreme as Sulzer, but he is very much far away from the Lockean end of the spectrum and much closer to the Sulzerian position, and this is one crude measure. This chapter 5 on moral culture has a total of 22 paragraphs. 6 of them are about punishment, 5 of them are about obedience and disobedience, and so that then is to say about half of the emphasis is on those traits and very little to nothing on play, liberty, and natural inclinations. So we'll end there.